What is the greatest lie ever created? What is the most vicious obscenity ever perpetrated on mankind? Slavery, the Holocaust, dictatorship. No, it's the tool with which all that wickedness is built. Altruism.
She fled communist Russia in 1926. You've been called a fascist.
I abhor fascism. I abhor the use of force.
Enslaves industrialists. How?
By a morality that requires a man's efforts benefit everyone but himself.
Execrable claptrap. The reviews. Outpouring of hate, longer than life and twice as preposterous, crack-brained, they go on and on. Applauds the destruction of the weak to the advantage of the strong. Rand is arguing for a dictatorship.
You don't care if the poor starve.
Are you the head of a cult?
You're preaching selfishness. That's all it is.
This country took you in and gave you refuge. Don't you feel you owe it anything?
Yes, of course I do. And I have given it. I have given it everything I have. My work, my books, my life. I gave my life to this work. And so books are printed and critics tell their lies. And no one speaks out to defend me. No one. No one, not to even say I exist. As if I was exist.
I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow?
The parasite hates three things: free markets, free will, and free men.
Symmetry, dear Steinman. It's time we did something about symmetry.
The artist has a duty to seduce the ear and delight the spirit.
When Rapture speaks of you, it says only this: your day is done.
That hair Sam said, that is our Masha? Masha!
They come to Rapture thinking they're gonna be captains of industry. But they all forget that somebody's gotta scrub the toilets.
I love Mr. Ryan, but I love Rapture. If I have to kill one to save the other, so be it.
Break that sweet puppy's neck. No, please. Break that puppy's neck. Would you kindly? No. No.
Andrew Ryan reminds us we all make choices, but in the end, our choices make us.
BioShock is a critically acclaimed first-person shooter game released in 2007, which was developed by 2K Boston, later renamed to Irrational Games. BioShock is a popular game title that is renowned by gamers everywhere, loved for its engaging story, its intuitive game mechanics, and its attention to detail. Due to BioShock's popularity and financial success, the BioShock experience has been expanded with multiple sequels and spin-offs, including BioShock 2, BioShock Infinite, and the Burial at Sea expansion packs. BioShock is set in the fictional underwater city of Rapture just after the 1950s, when the world was engulfed in the Cold War and tensions from atomic nuclear warfare was high. A small group of frustrated business tycoons, scientists, engineers, and artists retreated into the newly constructed underwater city of Rapture, where their talents and passions were fostered and encouraged, whilst being free from outside government control. Because of the isolation and the many challenges of living in an underwater city, differences and conflicts grew within Rapture's population. Instability continued to escalate until a violent civil war broke out, which ravaged the city and destroyed the Rapture way of life. The player enters the game during the climax of Rapture's Civil War, where the player, much like other characters, are manipulated to perform certain actions that go against their self-interest. By the end of the BioShock experience, Rapture is left as a dystopian ruin, where most of the memorable characters have either died or have fled the city. Through the engaging story of BioShock and its memorable characters, the player is exposed to complex intellectual narratives and political ideas throughout their playthroughs. which are gaming elements that are rarely seen in modern games today. Because of its popularity, BioShock is still referenced in various pop culture discussions relating to philosophy, politics, economics, and culture. Ken Levine, the creative lead of Irrational Games, purposely based most of the themes of BioShock from Ayn Rand, a world-renowned philosopher of the 20th century. She was the author of many books, including The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, which are widely influential works that are still read and referenced to this day. The City of Rapture embodies much of the philosophy Ayn Rand talks about, preferencing reason, individualism, and heroism above all else. Rapture also captures the spirit of early American culture, as it was a city that embraced liberty, capitalism, and small limited government. And so while most gamers might not be aware of the works of Ayn Rand or early American culture, if they have played this game, then they have been introduced to these themes indirectly. Because of this, BioShock stands as the only video game in popular culture that has successfully encapsulated Ayn Rand's work and the themes of American classical liberalism into a gaming audience worldwide. But what exactly is the philosophy of Ayn Rand? How did her philosophy cause Rapture to fail? And what philosophical lessons can be learnt from this game and the fictional characters in it? This is Love, Life and Anarchy, and I will be answering these questions as we explore the philosophy of BioShock.
What is the difference between a man and a parasite? A man builds, a parasite asks, where's my share? A man creates, a parasite says, what will the neighbors think? A man invents, a parasite says, watch out, or you might tread on the toes of God.
The creator thinks, the parasite copies. The creator produces, the parasite loots. The creator's concern is the conquest of nature. The parasite's concern is the conquest of men. The parasite seeks power. He wants to bind all men together in common action and common slavery. He claims that man is only a tool for the use of others, that he must think as they think, act as they act, and live in selfless, joyless servitude to any need but his own.
That man must work for others, concern himself with others, or be responsible for them. That is the role of a sacrificial object. I say that man is entitled to his own happiness and that he must achieve it himself, but that he cannot demand that others give up their lives to make him happy. And nor should he wish to sacrifice himself for the happiness of others.
Andrew Ryan is the main protagonist of BioShock and the most iconic character of the first game. He is described as an extremely successful American business tycoon, owning a significant chunk of America's coal, the second biggest railroad, and Ryan Oil. Being a self-made man, he held the conviction that men forged their own destiny and were responsible for their own path. Andrew Ryan shared many similarities with other protagonists from Ayn Rand's works, combining the egotistic moral ideals of Howard Rourke from The Fountainhead, the industrialist and entrepreneurial spirit of Hank Rearden from Atlas Shrugged, and the heroism and philosophy of John Galt, also from Atlas Shrugged. But the biggest influence of Andrew Ryan's character was Ayn Rand herself. In fact, his name is an anagram of hers. Andrew Ryan was born in Minsk, Belarus, not far from Ayn Rand's birthplace of St. Petersburg in Russia, which both became a part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, after its revolution. Both Ayn Rand and Andrew Ryan lived through the October Revolution, where the Bolsheviks took control over the provisional government and politically transformed Russia into their socialist image. Inspired from Marxist ideology, the Socialist Republic expropriated all means of production and nationalized private industries into the communist state. Ayn Rand's father had both his business and building confiscated by the Soviets, displacing her family and sentencing her to a life of poverty through communist rule. At a young age, Ayn Rand knew she was more gifted than her other students, as her grades were constantly at the top of all her classes in all her schools. Wanting to be a writer, she spent most of her time in classrooms writing books and short stories, while ignoring the public education that was administered by the Soviet state. She also felt dissatisfied with the constant Soviet mysticism that was all around her. When she went to college, she attended political debates that hosted discussions that were openly against Lenin's regime and communist rule. In these schools, people who used to call each other friends would begin to accuse each other of being betrayers of the People's Revolution. The accused would then disappear from these schools, where they would be sent to prisons and gulags and political purges. Andrew Ryan's father, dissatisfied with Lenin's regime, would often speak against communist rule in his community as well. But once he got word from an Orthodox priest that he was targeted for a political purge, he fled the country with his son Andrew Ryan before it could happen. As a child, Andrew Ryan personally witnessed his family's friends get shot by the Red Guards as they tried to flee Russia. This was the first time he witnessed the brutality of the state. Once in America, he grew up to see the results of socialist policies in his homeland. In the name of humanity, rights and freedoms were abolished. Property was expropriated, and there were executions without trial. Torture chambers, slave labor camps, and mass slaughter became the norm. He observed the desperate efforts made by hundreds of thousands of people struggling to escape from their socialist countries. He watched footage of people retreating over barbed wire fences, running from machine gun fire in East Berlin, and saw the bodies of bullet-ridden children that tried to flee. Andrew Ryan could no longer believe that socialism, in any of its forms, was motivated by benevolent men who wanted to abolish poverty, promote prosperity, or bring peace to mankind, but was motivated by parasites who only desired to enslave others.
When you come into this country, all things are possible for you. You can forget the past, you can have a brave new world.
The things that Edison invented are so omnipresent in our society. We live in a world that Edison invented.
Henry Ford was a revolutionary. He changed all of 20th century America. We're living in Henry Ford's world right now.
As an industrialist, he championed advancements in aerospace, satellite, and spy technology.
Like many other entrepreneurs, Andrew Ryan and Ayn Rand benefited from the capitalistic environment that early America adopted. Andrew Ryan became an industrialist and business tycoon, while Ayn Rand fulfilled her dream of becoming a successful writer. She wrote novels and movie screenplays to the Western world that appreciated her works. Other European industrialists who migrated to early America also shared similar success stories. Henry Ford created the first affordable family car which revolutionized American culture. Howard Hughes made many advancements in aviation and aerospace technologies that are still being used today. An industrialist tycoon, Andrew Carnegie, went from rags to riches by expanding the American steel industry, dedicating his life to improving society once he retired. All of these tycoons would eventually become influential philanthropists, using their wealth and influence to build libraries, medical institutions, and with the case of Henry Ford, built a traditional American town to help preserve a historical period of American life. However, both Andrew Ryan and Ayn Rand saw how the US government was increasingly adopting socialist policies, which especially occurred under the Democrats. Franklin Roosevelt's presidency passed new legislations which would introduce interventionist economic policies, such as implementing a social security system, federalizing intrusions into union management, beginning public works programs, increased tax rates, implemented price controls, started minimum wage, and abandoned the gold standard. These legislations formed the largest expansion of federal government power in America's peacetime history. To Andrew Ryan and Ayn Rand, Roosevelt's legislations was a sign that their once free country had been subverted. Andrew Ryan and his father fled the Bolsheviks to prosper in the land of the free. But this wasn't the land of the free it pretended to be. It was the land of the taxed. And once Andrew Ryan's anti-communist father refused to pay his fair share of taxes and protest, he was arrested and placed in jail.
I despise what this civilization is becoming, Sullivan. First the Bolsheviks and then Roosevelt. Truman carrying on much of what Roosevelt began. Little men on the backs of great ones. It will only stop when real men stand up and say no more.
When Hiroshima was destroyed by a single bomb wielded by the same US government, Andrew Ryan saw that as the ultimate betrayal of American ideals and the death of his nation. The government had used the science and the wealth of others to create a weapon that could destroy anything they could not control. These same governments were then locked into a tense standoff between the Eastern and Western Bloc, beginning the Cold War, which threatened to escalate into a nuclear war. These events made Andrew Ryan believe that atomic warfare was inevitable.
Where in the world is there a place for men like us? My father and I fled the Bolsheviks, and where did we end up? This isn't the land of the free it pretends to be. It's the land of the taxed. Every society is the same on the face of the earth these days.
The potential destruction of civilization through atomic warfare is what finally motivated Andrew Ryan to order the covert construction of the underwater city Rapture, a city that was outside of government control, where politicians could not rule, and a place that was safe from nuclear warfare. The backstory of Rapture was heavily inspired by Ayn Rand's book, Atlas Shrugged.
Atlas Shrugged. A big book. A big theme. What's it about?
Simply put, the mind on strike.
Whose mind?
The minds that matter. Scientists, inventors, artists, industrialists, the motors that run the world. I show what happens when that motor stops.
And what's that?
Chaos, both spiritual and physical.
Atlas Shrugged depicts a dystopian society sliding into economic destruction due to totalitarianism and excess government regulation. Industry leaders and entrepreneurs begin to disappear from society, leaving behind their businesses and capital investments. As new laws and regulations continue to strangle the industries of the world, vital services such as transport, food production, and energy services begin to decline or halt. We learned that the people who were responsible for these industries were encouraged to strike as a form of political protest against the government and a world that didn't appreciate them. They built a secret city known as Galt's Gulch, a free society made by people who value the ideas of individualism, liberty, and capitalism. Eventually, the government collapses on the outside world, and industry leaders return from the hiding in Galt's Gulch to build a better world without the government's involvement. Both the fictional city of Galt's Gulch and Rapture were built for the same reasons, to politically protest the world and go on strike. While Galt's Gulch was built into a valley and was camouflaged from the outside world, the city of Rapture was built at the bottom of the Atlantic, which brought many challenges and complications with it. The construction of Rapture, or the North Atlantic Project, was inspired by the Panama Canal, the largest and most difficult engineering project ever undertaken at the time. It is an artificial waterway canal based in Panama that connects the Atlantic Ocean with the Pacific Ocean. Ships that pass through the canal save 2 weeks of travel time, completing the journey in under 10 hours. Through a series of locks and chambers, ships are guided through a passage through to an artificial lake that is built 26 meters above sea level. The Panama Canal is considered to be one of the 7 wonders of the industrial world. Andrew Ryan and his close team of engineers used the Panama Canal as an example of what was possible. It took most of Andrew Ryan's assets and resources to create Rapture, liquidating his coal assets, railway stocks, and oil companies to purchase the materials and laborers needed for construction. He also created a series of new technologies for the project, which included a see-through alloy that could withstand the high pressures of the sea, called submolecular bonding. It was used to connect the underwater structures of Rapture together. Buildings and structures were lowered into the seabed from the surface by deep-sea welders and mechanics. Buildings with aluminium frames were submerged and fastened into the seabed foundation, and ocean water was pumped out of living spaces once rooms were completed and airtight. Rapture was also constructed near a massive hydrothermal vent, providing a near-endless supply of geothermal energy that was harnessed by Andrew Ryan and his engineering team. It provided Rapture with an abundance of heat and power, avoiding the need for coal, oil, and solar panels. The goal of Rapture was to be a self-sustaining city that could run itself without intervention from the outside world. It would be out of the control of the warmongering great powers of the surface, which included the United States government, British intelligence, and the Soviet bloc. It was expected to grow across the seabed until it eventually spread out onto the top of the sea. The great city-state would then outcompete with the nations of the world and replace them, becoming the capital city of the new world. Both Galt's Gulch and Rapture were built on the ideas of objectivism, the name of the philosophy that originated from Ayn Rand. Objectivism is a guide to living a virtuous life based on reason. It starts with metaphysics. Objectivism states that reality exists, and it exists independently of us and our consciousness. That means we discover reality through our senses, not through faith or mysticism. As we discover and analyze the objective world around us, we use our mind's ability to reason to make sense of it. Through the unique human ability of using reason, we are able to make the objective world serve us, rather than the other way around. Commitment to reason and critical thinking leads to the rejection of religion, the supernatural, and anything else that cannot be empirically verified, favoring reality or reason above all else. This is why both Andrew Ryan and Ayn Rand were atheists, who rejected the idea of God.
You don't approve of religion because?
Because it's mystical, because it's based on faith, not on reason and facts.
The objectivist view on happiness is based on the Aristotelian view on happiness. Aristotle argued that happiness comes from ourselves, and that it was based on rational self-interest and self-fulfillment. Aristotle argued that self-love was the highest form of love, and that self-love was needed for virtuous living. Because of this, serving other people's happiness can only come after serving your own happiness. Or said another way, saying "I love you" only has real meaning when you use the word I. This was later fleshed out in objectivism to ultimately reject altruism, which can be heard in some of Andrew Ryan's speeches. Altruism is defined as self-sacrifice being the highest form of moral value, that serving others is the only justification of existence, and that you have no right to exist for your own sake, but only exist for the needs of others. Both Ayn Rand and Andrew Ryan believed that most, if not all, evils of the world was due to people being manipulated by altruism and the emotional prejudices that altruism enables. That evil is not enabled by selfishness, but by wanting to serve others before yourself, and that the world would be a better place if people put their self-interest above self-sacrifice.
Whenever anyone wants others to do their work, they call upon their altruism. Never mind your own needs, they say. Think of the needs of the state, of the poor, of the army, of the king, of God. The list goes on and on. How many catastrophes were launched with the words, "Think of yourself"? It's the king and country crowd who light the torch of destruction.
I'm challenging the moral code of altruism, the precept that man's moral duty is to live for others, that man must sacrifice himself to others, which is the present-day morality.
Altruism is not to be confused with kindness, goodwill, or respect for others, but the rejection of oneself for the happiness of others. Giving to charity or helping others should be seen as something you want to do out of self-love, not something that you are forced to do out of self-sacrifice.
Why is it good to want others to be happy, but not yourself? You can make others happy when and if those others mean something to you. If you love them, then you want to make them happy. Fine. If you don't love them, that's not a moral crime. You don't have to love everybody. You cannot love everybody because it's a meaningless expression. You can love only those whom you value. If they contribute to your happiness, you contribute to theirs.
To ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow?
There have been many variations of altruism throughout human history. Under religion, some of the followers of the faith are expected to sacrifice their own self-interest for the good of God or for the good of church. Under the Soviet Socialist Republic, Russians were expected to sacrifice their own self-interest for the good of the people. Under Roosevelt's New Deal, people were expected to sacrifice their own self-interest for the good of the poor. And under many contemporary democratic nations, people are expected to sacrifice their own self-interest for the good of social justice.
In the working out of a great national program that seeks the primary good of the greater number, it is true that the toes of some people are being stepped on and are going to be stepped on. But these toes belong to the comparative few who seek to retain or to gain position or riches or both by some shortcut that is harmful to the greater good.
There is nobody in this country who got rich on his own. Nobody. You built a factory out there, good for you, but I want to be clear, you moved your goods to market on the roads the rest of us paid for. You built a factory and it turned into something terrific or a great idea. God bless. Keep a big hunk of it. But part of the underlying social contract is you take a hunk of that and pay forward for the next kid who comes along.
And what we then do is ask for the wealthy to pay a little bit more. Bridges, if you got a business, that you didn't build that. Somebody else made that happen. We rise or fall together as one nation and as one people, and that's the reason I'm running for president, because I still believe in that idea.
Yes, in my view, the government of a democratic society has a moral responsibility to play a vital role in making sure that all of our people have a decent standard of living.
And give that body to the state for the collective effort of the...
That's right, for the good of the whole and sacrifice to the state. And whoever says it is or wants to be the state.
Under altruism, individuals are seen as sacrificial animals that don't have a right to exist for their own sake, but only exist to serve others. That individuals are expected to sacrifice their own interests for the greater good or for social justice, which could mean class, gender, race, sexuality, or a combination of those things.
My organization works on behalf of the American Jewish community, which is why 6 million people were trapped inside of Europe during the Holocaust and couldn't escape. Is America turned its back on refugees during that period, just like we're turning our back on refugees right now. We're not responsible for the crisis in Syria, but we do have some responsibility to protect the refugees who are fleeing for their lives.
What I don't believe in is collective guilt. And that's why I'm confused by the phrase white privilege.
Well, white privilege doesn't suggest guilt, it suggests responsibility and accountability. I don't believe in collective guilt, but I do believe in collective responsibility.
Responsibility and guilt are synonyms in this case.
I find it galling to be told by a middle-aged bloke in this place that it is not a legitimate service to offer support for working mums in terms of paying for childcare.
Poverty is sexist. Our societies cannot succeed without the full participation and empowerment of women and girls.
The only differences in all of these examples is the question of who is to be sacrificed and to what cause. A free and rational society is one where man lives by his own mind. For his own sake, he neither sacrifices himself to others, nor sacrifices others to him.
My husband and I got married because of you. I just wanted you to know that.
Without being lengthy about it, what attracted you to Miss Ring?
I liked the idea of not being ashamed to be proud of what I am and who I am. And that's basically it.
You feel there's pressures?
In today's society, I think there's a great deal of pressure.
Isn't American chauvinism one of the issues that we all have to look at and examine in terms of what it may lead us to do that may not be in our own long-term best interest?
I really don't see that as a problem. I see as a problem what she was talking about in Iran, where we have the technology, the intelligence, and everything else, give it to everybody else, and then all of a sudden we turn out to be the bad guys. Where is the justice?
You agree?
Do I agree with the speaker? Oh, yes, completely.
Ayn Rand believed that the causes of totalitarianism came from two phenomenons: man's rejection of reason and man's rejection of self-interest. Andrew Ryan saw how the rejection of reason and self-interest corrupted Russia as a child, and that it was now corrupting the last bastion of freedom as an adult, America.
Simply put, the mind on strike.
Whose mind?
The minds that matter. Scientists, inventors, artists, industrialists, the motors that run the world. I show what happens when that motor stops.
And what's that?
Chaos, both spiritual and physical.
Is that a surprise?
It is to a world that enslaves them.
Enslaves industrialists? How?
By a morality that requires a man's efforts benefit everyone but himself.
On the surface, the parasite expects the doctor to heal them for free, the farmer to feed them out of charity. How little they differ from the pervert who prowls the streets looking for a victim he can ravish for his grotesque amusement.
Andrew Ryan intended to prove that reason and self-interest was at the root of all successful civilizations, that self-interest fueled the growth of business and freedom, and that the tentacles of government could only get in the way of that, damaging the progress of science, technology, and growth. When the realities and values of objectivism are seen as priorities in society, it ultimately leads to a capitalistic environment, where the individual holds the right to property and trade in each of their hands, that their self-interest is preferenced above self-sacrifice, and that the role of government is limited to only protecting the rights and freedoms of others. This was the economic system that Rapture embraced, and the economic system that Ayn Rand advocated for, a totally laissez-faire, unregulated, uncontrolled capitalism. Citizens and business owners were expected to oversee and self-regulate themselves, without the involvement of governments. This pure system of capitalism that Rapture adopted has never existed in the world, not even in early America, as various degrees of government control has always been undercutting and distorting the market from its inception. Being a completely unregulated city, Andrew Ryan hoped its economic policies would attract the innovative scientists, engineers, and industrialists who are dissatisfied with the regulatory shackles that the governments have placed on them. them and their industries. They were compelled to join Rapture and work towards its vision of free men and free industry. This unbridled capitalism is represented in Rapture as the Great Chain, a metaphor that describes the binding force of all actions in a market economy.
I believe in no God, no invisible man in the sky. But there is something more powerful than each of us, a combination of our efforts, a great chain of industry that unites us. But it is only when we struggle in our own interest that the chain pulls society in the right direction. The chain is too powerful and too mysterious for any government to guide. Any man who tells you different either has his hand in your pocket or a pistol to your neck.
Adam Smith, famous economist of the 18th century, coined the similar term the invisible hand. The invisible hand, much like the Great Chain, describes the unintended economic benefits of all individual actions within a community. Through the power of market forces and free men, the invisible hand guided society to help achieve its greatest outcomes, both morally and economically. Trying to control the invisible hand or the Great Chain would mean introducing tyranny, something that Andrew Ryan was abhorrently against. While the construction of Rapture was challenging and extravagantly expensive, Andrew Ryan's greatest fear was that Rapture would eventually be found out by external governments. Governments, unions, and communists could one day worm their way into the city and pillage its mysteries for the outside world. The new technologies that was used to build the new colony, such as submolecular bonding, could be stolen, patented, and made a fortune on. Governments could also use these technologies to help give them the advantage in the Cold War. It was important for its new citizens to commit to Rapture and not expose its secrets, as secrecy was Rapture's only defense against external governments. This led to Rapture's single governing policy, which, apart from policies against murderers, thieves, and rapists, would become Rapture's only rule. No contact with the outside world. Immigrating to Rapture was a one-way trip. There would be no contact with the outside world once inside. No trade, no letters, no money transfers, and no correspondence with the surface. No one could leave until Rapture was larger, more established, and the risk of nuclear war had gone, which Andrew Ryan predicted it would take at least a generation. Nobody could come in or out without authorization. People were expected to live there, trade there, and make it work, which requires the complete commitment of its citizens. Everyone who was invited to Rapture was made to understand this rule and consented before they could join. Rapture wasn't a city to visit, it was a way of life. Although it could be argued that Andrew Ryan was justified in setting up this one policy to protect Rapture's existence, the complete restriction of free trade and travel with the outside world is something that capitalism and objectivism does not advocate. Even in early American history, where its economic policies were similar to Rapture's, Europeans were still free to leave their country and return home if they were dissatisfied with the American experience. Rapture didn't share this policy. Andrew Ryan's one rule more closely reflected the totalitarian policies of self-described communist states, such as North Korea, East Germany, and Soviet Russia, where people were not permitted to join or leave without authorization. So while Rapture embraced the free market and laissez-faire policies within the city, it was closed off from trade and contact outside of it. This one rule would later create significant economic, cultural, and political conflicts, which would ultimately lead to Rapture's civil war. Due to Rapture's hands-off economic policies, Ryan's hopes and ideals for Rapture came true, becoming the world leader in innovation, freedom, prosperity, and entrepreneurship. From 1946 to 1958, Rapture experienced tremendous economic progress, political stability, a culture of entrepreneurship, numerous business establishments, and unprecedented scientific advancements, just as Ryan predicted it would do. Technology leaped decades ahead of the surface, with inventions such as a geothermal power station, a self-sustaining biosphere, and a gene-based supercomputer. Rapture's economic successes and prosperity progress also correlates with societies that similarly embraced hands-off capitalistic policies, which is a relatively new idea in economic theory. European powers used to adopt the dominant economic theory of mercantilism, where mainstream economists advocated that state power was needed to regulate the nation's economy for the purpose of building a wealthy and powerful state. But many anti-mercantilist economists found important flaws within its theory, namely that prices and wealth was not fixed, and that the value of trading with other rival nations was understated. By removing the restrictions and regulations in mercantilism, they argued that all commerce in agriculture and economy would flourish. These anti-mercantilist thinkers would become the French economic movement called the Physiocrats. The Physiocrats were the first to develop the idea of laissez-faire economics, arguing that markets function best when it's free of government constraints and meddling. These economists argued that it was self-interest that drove the economy, not state power, which directly counters the theory of mercantilism. This laissez-faire theory was developed 100 years before the Industrial Revolution, having the foresight to predict the basis of economic growth before it happened. The Physiocrats was later enforced by Adam Smith in his magnum opus, The Wealth of Nations, where he also advocated for a free market that regulated itself through self-interest, conceptualizing the metaphor of an invisible hand that worked like the Great Chain. Adam Smith and other Enlightenment thinkers were majorly inspired by earlier English philosopher John Locke. Considered to be the father of classical liberalism, John Locke argued that the only role government had was to protect our natural rights, namely the right to our lives, the right to our liberty, and the right to our property. During the American Revolutionary War, where North American colonies rebelled against the English crown, Thomas Jefferson drafted the United States Declaration of Independence to include these themes. In the draft, he wrote that all men were created equal with certain unalienable rights, including the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Once North America achieved its independence, the Bill of Rights was constitutionalized to protect individual liberties over entrenching governmental powers. The nation embraced a culture of freedom and entrepreneurship, which, similar to Rapture, attracted the more driven Europeans who were dissatisfied with the rule of kings and emperors within their own nations, allowing them the right to forge their own destinies in America. The limited government and freedoms that America embraced meant the economic growth of the United States jumped to the international lead, even out-competing the industrialized society of Britain. The first transcontinental railroad, built in America by 3 private companies, transformed the country into an economic powerhouse. The United States would later become the world leader in applied technology and industrial progress. 500,000 of new American patents were issued for inventions in 30 years. Thomas Edison established the first electrical lighting grid, powering streetlights at night and electric streetcars in lower Manhattan. The North American Kerosene Gaslight Company produced affordable kerosene, which replaced whale oil for lighting homes. And Henry Ford revolutionized the assembly line, making the Ford Model T car available to the middle class across America. Because of these factors, the US economy rose its fastest rate during the late 19th century, which is described as America's Gilded Age. In the Gilded Age, real wages, wealth, GDP, and capital formations all increased rapidly. America became the envy of the world, causing many foreigners to ask, what was the secret to American success? However, many of these wealthy industrialists and financiers would be negatively criticized and denounced as robber barons by their critics. These critics argued that their fortunes were not earned through the self-determination of their efforts, but through the expense and exploitation of their workers. But other admirers disagreed, arguing that they were not robber barons, but captains of industry, who were responsible for establishing the core of America's industrial economic power, as well as helping non-profit charities through personal acts of philanthropy.
"You are my ideal of a self-made man," wrote one admirer. "You are loved by thousands of people all over the world," gushed another. "You have done more good and accomplished more for the people than any man living. Do not let them discourage you."
During America's Gilded Age, wage labor was widely condemned as wage slavery in socialist and working class circles. Labor leaders and communists would almost always use the phrase wage slavery or wage exploitation instead of wage labor when describing the nature of the working class. As the economic shift towards wage labor gained further momentum in America, working class organizations became more militant in their efforts to strike down wage labor and the system of capitalism, which peaked with the assassination of the 25th President William McKinley. Capitalism was also criticized in that it distributed wealth unequally. The wages that workers earned could never match the value earned by the captains of industry, who built and transformed America's economy. The wealthiest 2% of American households owned more than a third of the nation's wealth, while the bottom 40% had no wealth at all. This created resentment throughout the lower classes, which was additionally fueled by the socialist narrative. Despite the philanthropy efforts of business tycoons, the disparity between the working class and capitalist class prompted the rise of socialist, anarchist, and communist groups within America, along with worker strikes and militant labor movements. Socialist policies also became entrenched in government policies, manifesting into Roosevelt's first and Second New Deal, which forever changed the economic culture of America through public policy. Both Ayn Rand and Andrew Ryan, who lived through a similar paradigm change in Russia, saw worker unions and similar socialist movements as irrational, evil, and parasitical. The parasites who adopted the collectivist narrative of altruism and social justice were not interested in liberation, progress, innovation, or success, but were only interested in exploiting and enslaving others. The natural occurrence of inequality that happened during the economic development of early America also occurred during the economic development of early Rapture. Industrialists, entrepreneurs, inventors, and scientists who were talented and completed high-valued projects would outperform the cleaners, the maintenance workers, and the fishermen. Rapture attracted the industrialists and entrepreneurs, but very few of them could dig ditches or plumb pipes. The city was in a constant short supply of maintenance workers who could work with sewage, cleaning, and landscaping tasks for Rapture's maintenance. Many of these blue-collar workers who were invited to the city for contractual work were stuck there once their contracts were completed, sometimes waiting weeks for their next project. Some of these people didn't understand just how sealed off they were from the outside world, creating conflicts when things didn't work out their way. Andrew Ryan underestimated how many people were needed for basic maintenance work within Rapture, and so he began to invite people who were not as committed to Rapture's ideals as he had hoped, something he'd later regret. Not all people had large investment funds or personal savings that they could convert to Rapture dollars, and once their money ran out, they couldn't wire in more from the outside world. Rapture's population exceeded 18,000 souls at its peak, and there wasn't enough housing built for all of them. These workers were expected to earn their way out of their position, find a way to branch out, take on a second job, and invest. Just like what Andrew Ryan did when he arrived in America. To Andrew Ryan, Rapture was not a prison, but liberation from the outside world. Others didn't share that viewpoint. Rapture was opposed to taxes and regulations that typically funded government programs such as Social Security, national health care, and other welfare systems in the outside world. In the law of Rapture, people were repulsed by the idea of private charities or helping each other out in times of distress. Ruben Grave, head of engineering, describes charity as a dependency that interfered with the natural order of the Darwinian process. Before the government enabled welfare policies, charities and mutual aid were organized through private communities and mutual associations, known as friendly societies. Friendly societies provided financial and social services to private individuals, offering them the services of charity, insurance, pensions, and cooperative banking without the objective of turning a profit. These mutual organizations composed of volunteers who joined together for a common financial or social purpose that would be based according to religion, politics, or trade affiliations. These societies are still widespread in many parts of the developed world, but because of modern insurance and the compulsion of the welfare state, they are not as prominent as they used to be. There is no reason to suggest that the citizens of Rapture would not help each other in times of need, as many of them were friends that shared many common interests. In the fictional town Gold's Gulch, which the Rapture City was inspired by, the citizens were made up of friends, companions, and even lovers who helped each other because of the similar values that they all shared. This reality was not demonstrated in Rapture. Instead, people were depicted to be fiercely against each other and were divided through class conflict. None of the 18,000 people in Rapture were interested in helping anyone out, making private charities or friendly societies non-existent in Rapture. Because contact with the outside world was severed in Rapture and private charities didn't exist, a dissatisfied underclass grew. These underclasses formed worker unions in Rapture, which Andrew Ryan regarded as absolutely taboo. They were similarly susceptible to the collective and altruistic narratives that were used in America and Russia, that the upper classes were exploiting the workers of Rapture through wage slavery, that Andrew Ryan had lured its citizens into Rapture just so he could enslave them, and that Rapture was not a utopia, but a prison for the lower classes. It was these same narratives that similarly caused the workers' militia in Russia to rebel against the upper class in the Bolshevik Revolution. Andrew Ryan was witnessing the same dangers that corrupted the outside world worm its way into Rapture. The two major characters that formed these union groups and pushed this narrative was psychiatrist Sophia Lamb, who was initially invited to Rapture to help soothe the distressing psychological effects of living under the ocean, and the con artist Frank Goland, who stole the identity of Frank Fontaine in order to swindle his way into Rapture as a fishing contractor. Andrew Ryan initially invited Sophia Lamb to provide counseling for the isolated population of Rapture. Sophia Lamb was a firm believer of the utilitarian ideal of the greater good, meaning that the best behaviors are the ones that maximizes the interests of the collective, which was the ultimate value people should be striving for. While Andrew Ryan believed in rational self-interest and rejected altruism, Sophia Lamb rejected rational self-interest and embraced altruism. It wasn't long before she clashed with Andrew Ryan and his ideas, creating a new subversive movement within Rapture. To Sophia Lamb, a true utopia could only be based in unity and collective sharing, not through individualism and property rights. Sophia Lamb's gradual revolution would first be placed in the minds of her patients through her therapy sessions, and then through action. She had the goal of transforming Rapture from within. In her therapy sessions, she noticed that her patients held feelings of mistrust towards Andrew Ryan. They felt they were misled into what Rapture would be like, and why they were brought underwater. She discovered that social anxiety was more prevalent in the lower classes than the higher class. The patients who saw Sophia Lamb were immediately exposed to a collectivist rhetoric. She attempted to sway the distressed workers of Rapture away from Andrew Ryan's individualist philosophy into a collectivist, altruistic one. Andrew Ryan soon discovered that it was Sophia Lamb who was encouraging these worker unions and class conflicts. Hoping to discourage Lamb's influence in Rapture, Andrew Ryan would invite her to a series of public debates to show the flaws in her reasoning. But the debates had the opposite effects. The lower classes found Sophia Lamb to be more likable and relatable, while Andrew Ryan's rhetoric of the Great Chain held little appeal. Eventually, Lamb became so much of a threat to Andrew Ryan that he resorted to less ethical means to bring her under control. After discovering her true intentions, he arrested Sophia Lamb and placed her in a makeshift penal colony in Rapture. She eventually escaped from her prison after the events of the original game, and transformed her followers into a religious cult. This religious cult, named the Rapture Family, were the committed believers of Lamb's collectivist ideals, becoming Rapture's zealots and the main antagonists of the second BioShock game. Frank Fontaine, the second character who promoted the opposite narrative in Rapture, was the main antagonist of the first BioShock game. He is described as a con man, a criminal mastermind, and the arch enemy of Andrew Ryan, who led the power struggle that started Rapture's civil war. Before he was Frank Fontaine, he was an orphan who worked as a stage boy in a theater. He appreciated the power of acting, that his peers could influence their audience through performance art, costumes, and misdirection. With his experience at the theater, he would later undertake multiple fake personalities and identities, which helped him swindle unsuspecting victims, changing his name from Moskowitz to Winston to Goland, and even Wang when he pretended to be a Chinaman for 6 months. His last job before he joined Rapture was being a bookkeeper for a gambling ring. He would use his acting and manipulation skills to fix the results of fights to his advantage, as well as overhearing private rumors that helped him organize his bets. He first learnt of Rapture when a federal agent pressured him to find underground rumors pertaining to Andrew Ryan's secret North Atlantic project. Frank Goland first heard of Andrew Ryan while he was hiding in a freight train and on the run from the law. Riding in the boxcar, he found an old newspaper about the newly minted Industrialist. There was a picture of Andrew Ryan standing in front of the skyline of Manhattan, with a building with his name on it. This heroic image of Andrew Ryan stirred an emotional response from Frank.
Whatever he's got, I want it. And I'm gonna take it from him.
When he discovered that the same Andrew Ryan was managing a secret project in the North Atlantic, it fascinated him. Millions of dollars were being sunk into the ocean. It attracted him in like buried gold attracted a treasure hunter. He wanted to scoop some of it up. Once Frank Goland was able to find out about the existence of Rapture through blackmail and manipulation, he took on the persona of Frank Fontaine, who was the identity of the fishing boat captain he had killed to get into Rapture. Frank knew that Rapture was some sort of utopia, but he also knew what happened with utopias. He thought of the Soviets, how their fine words about the proletariat and working man's paradise had turned into gulags and breadlines. Utopia was a perfect opportunity for men like him, and once this undersea utopia fell apart, Frank would be there with a whole society to feast on. Frank Fontaine represented the complete opposite virtues that Ayn Rand had argued for. Fontaine did not see individuals as producers or traders, but as fools to be plundered from. He used dishonesty and manipulation to mislead others, stealing their resources or their identities for his own goals. He had no interest in being honest and did not share Rapture's vision, as his primary goal right from the start was to pillage the secrets and the riches of the city. He held the attitude that others must live for his values, which were carried out through threats, falsehoods, and violence, which was, as Ayn Rand argued, completely evil and unacceptable moral behavior. Frank Fontaine was initially invited to Rapture because the fishing ships that he stole could be used to supply Rapture with resources. But being part of the fishing trade also gave Fontaine access to something that made Andrew Ryan nervous: the outside world. Fontaine's ships and subs left Rapture on their own accord, able to contact anyone from the surface. Once Fontaine noticed that the people of Rapture were getting sick of eating fish, he started to smuggle in beef and other goods that were impossible to find in Rapture. His smuggling ring would expand to include additional contraband items, including Bibles, cigarettes, and newspapers. Andrew Ryan had suspicions that Frank Fontaine was behind the smuggling ring, but he was unable to prove it, as Frank was experienced in the black market and could cover his tracks. The appearance of contraband angered Andrew Ryan, not necessarily because people were trading with the outside world, but because the continual exposure with the surface placed Rapture's secrecy at risk, which is why he implemented the no contact with the outside world policy. By imposing this trade policy, the Great Chain was forcefully pulled towards the direction of Andrew Ryan, resulting in a form of tyranny that stopped the supply of goods from the outside world. But as people grew dissatisfied with their living conditions and demanded goods from the outside world, it pulled the Great Chain back towards the people. This demand was fulfilled by Frank Fontaine and his smuggling ring. He earned the first of his Rapture riches through the black market this way. This kind of government interference is similar to how the government tries to control the war on drugs. When government restricts trade on specific items that people want, such as drugs, they create a black market. The black market, through its artificially strong profit motive, attracts the more ruthless and dangerous people to fulfill that demand, similar to the way Fontaine was drawn to it. These kind of smugglers, cartels, and mobsters are only around because the governments artificially created that environment for them to do business in. They could not exist as businesses if governments respected free trade and respected the rights of the individual. It is the government that created these black markets through their policies, and it was these policies that encouraged people like Fontaine to do business in them to fulfill that demand. Players can argue that Andrew Ryan was justified in restricting trade with the outside world, but players cannot argue that Andrew Ryan supported free trade or capitalism in principle from these policies. By restricting trade and banning certain goods from the outside world, he increased the power of his own government and interfered with the rights of the individual, something that Ayn Rand and free market economists do not advocate. The smuggling ring that Fontaine operated earned him significant resources within Rapture, but he wanted more power and influence before he was satisfied. A large proportion of all life on Earth live in the sea. Many ocean species are still yet to be discovered. Marine life was important to the people in Rapture, as citizens relied on its ecosystem for food, medicine, materials, and resources. One of the sea creatures that transformed the economy and culture of Rapture was a discovery of a unique sea slug, a fictional underwater creature indigenous to the seabed around Rapture. It was found to naturally produce a raw form of volatile genetic material. This material was called Adam, a substance that could create and manipulate different cell types. The concept of Adam is loosely based on the science of stem cells, a type of cell that has the remarkable capability to develop itself into different types of cells in the body, which can essentially divide without limitation to replenish other cells. These stem cells are capable of renewing themselves through cell division, and can be manipulated to become tissue or organ-specific cells that held specific functions. Given stem cells' unique regenerative capabilities, stem cells offer new medical possibilities for treating diseases, healing wounds, and repairing tissue damage that's still being developed today. In BioShock, Adam exaggerated the potential real-world use of stem cells. The scientists in Rapture were able to genetically manipulate Adam to produce beneficial medical procedures that is not yet possible in our real world. Not only could Adam treat diseases and repair tissue damage almost instantaneously, but it also allowed for genetic modification and mutations in our own bodies, granting users the ability to change themselves and the environments around them. Frank Fontaine quickly recognized the power of Adam and its potential commercial use in Rapture. He immediately invested into its research by financially sponsoring the scientists in Rapture to come up with practical uses for Adam. It didn't take long for the scientists to come up with plasmids, a commercially available serum that modified stem cells in the user's body. Plasmids allowed the user to develop special abilities, such as producing fire and generating electricity once the genetic alterations was made through Adam. Earlier batches of plasmids developed unwanted side effects when used. Plasmids worked by destroying damaged cells and replacing them with genetically modified new ones. Some of these cell growths were unstable, coming out as lesions and abnormal tumors in tissues. While responsible use of plasmids made these side effects minimal, irresponsible plasmid use led to excessive physical and mental damage, as too many natural cells were being replaced by genetically modified ones. The genetic alterations that plasmids changed also brought feelings of euphoria, which encouraged further plasmid use. This pleasant high experience, similar to opium and other stimulants, was speculated to become a possible cause of addiction in users that had low self-esteem. This euphoric rush increased the chance of plasmid abuse, especially since Adam was flexible enough to genetically modify almost anything in a person. The mental addiction of plasmids was a concern to the scientists, but to men like Frank Fontaine, he saw this as an exploitable business model. Bridget Tenenbaum, one of the scientists working on plasmids, was interested in developing an improved version of plasmids that minimized the side effects and removed the addictive nature of plasmids, but Fontaine argued against it, pushing to release these plasmids into the market in its current unstable form. When plasmids are injected into the body, they cause physiological changes to the users, which means plasmids can be accurately defined as a drug. Most drugs fall into two categories: pharmaceutical or psychoactive. Plasmids fall under both. Not only did plasmids have the pharmaceutical benefits of curing the sick and healing the wounded, but they also had the psychoactive effect of creating positive emotions, improving the body, and granting specific powers to users, something that no other drug can do. At first, plasmids were seen as a net positive to the people of Rapture. The pharmaceutical benefits of plasmids healed the sick, cured the crippled, and remedied the diseased. The cosmeceutical benefits of plasmids made people stronger, better looking, and boosted their self-esteem to become more confident. The recreational benefits of plasmids made people social, happier, and enhanced their fun, similar to what other recreational drugs do to people. And the genetic modification effects of plasmids transformed the economy and culture within Rapture. The electrobolt plasmids helped electricians perform their jobs by jump-starting generators that were broken or malfunctioning. The incinerate plasmids were used by chefs to start fires in their kitchens. The telekinesis plasmids was used by laborers to move around heavy cumbersome objects that was too difficult to transport on their own. And the spider plasmids was used by maintenance workers to get to hard-to-reach places in Rapture for repairs. With plasmids, one man can do the work of 5 men, fulfilling tasks more efficiently and completing jobs that could not be done before. Andrew Ryan saw plasmids as another example of Rapture's greatness, combining medicines, technology, and capitalism to create new possibilities that were decades ahead of the outside world, which stood as another testament of man's capabilities. But like most other drugs, some people could not handle the effects of plasmids and did not use them responsibly, which disproportionately affected the lower worker classes in Rapture. The positive and pleasant effects of plasmid use could not be replicated in any any other way, so the lower classes were more prone to atom abuse. The damaging effects of irresponsible plasmid use caused deformities, insanity, and even death in extreme cases. Laborers that used the telekinesis plasmids to move around heavy objects started to get into fights with other plasmid users, throwing around heavy objects in heated brawls. Distressed and enraged plasmid users would get into fights over non-issues, using plasmids such as Electrobolt and Incinerate against each other in violent confrontations. The general attitude of Rapture authorities was to only intervene once splicers harmed innocent bystanders. Plasmid users that got into fights with other plasmid users were seen as duels between two consenting adults, and was not seen as a crime that needed intervention. Other citizens of Rapture saw the deaths of excessive plasmid users as a self-regulating Darwinian purge, a way to weed out the weak of Rapture. And because Andrew Ryan was committed in the idea of free market and free enterprise, he was not willing to break his principles over these fights. He was more interested in seeing where plasmids would take Rapture. It was only when plasmid users within the cult of Sophia Lamb and the plasmid users within Frank Fontaine's criminal ring started to target and attack Rapture's authorities and members of the upper class did Andrew Ryan begin to get concerned. The Central Council was called in for a meeting to find solutions for excessive plasmid use. Rapture's Central Council was comprised of a very loose commission of Rapture citizens that oversaw enterprise and kept an eye on Rapture affairs. Some of the members of the Central Council include the head of security Sullivan and the head of maintenance Bill McDonough. Ryan was anti-government and was a non-interventionist. He didn't like to get involved in Rapture affairs unless it was imperative to do so. While Andrew Ryan took advice from his inner council members, the direction of Rapture would ultimately be decided by him, as he built the city and felt he was ultimately responsible for its future. Sullivan, the head of security, called for an immediate ban on all plasmid use and wanted to implement prohibition on its sales. Rapture had a non-interventionist policy on drugs. Shopkeepers in Rapture were known to distill moonshine in their chambers. Coca plants were also grown in private quarters to produce cocaine for sale and trade in Rapture. The inner circle always turned a blind eye to these practices and did not intervene. But because plasmid users were unstable, caused property damage, and were a powerful weapon against Rapture's authorities, prohibition seemed like the fastest and the most effective solution. But doing so would go against Rapture's core principles, and so Andrew Ryan resisted this option. Most of the council had also lived through the Prohibition era, where a nationwide constitutional ban was placed on alcoholic sales and production in America, which was placed after the Protestants complained that alcohol was creating an immoral society. Much like the contraband laws in Rapture, the Prohibition laws in America created an underclass of smugglers, cartels, and mobsters to fulfill that demand. Violence would spill into the streets as organized crime groups would compete with other gangs in the black market. Prohibition was eventually repealed by the Roosevelt presidency during the Great Depression, mostly because of the negative economic effects it had in agriculture business and the general economy. After its appeal, the original supporters of Prohibition openly admitted that Prohibition was a failure. This experience in American history, as well as upholding the values of what Rapture was founded on, influenced Andrew Ryan's decision in declining the plasmid ban. Another option, raised by Bill McDonough, was to compete with Frank Fontaine in the plasmid industry. To Andrew Ryan, Fontaine was seen as a competitive rival, fueling the fires of Andrew Ryan's ambitious spirit. He didn't want Fontaine to dominate the market, so Ryan Industries considered competing with him in a spirit of free enterprise. He planned to produce better and more useful plasmids that didn't have the side effects of the original batches, which would take a considerable amount of time and money to produce. Side effects and atom sickness was the only market constraint that kept responsible plasmid users from buying more. If Ryan Industries could resolve the issue of unwanted side effects, they would have a better product and would hold a more powerful position in the market. By the end of Minerva's Den, Dr. Tenenbaum had successfully created a plasmid that reversed all of the negative side effects of atom abuse. So it was possible to control the negative effects of plasmids given enough time and research. But time is something the Central Council didn't have. Sullivan had an informant inside Fontaine Futuristics that warned them that their scientists were working on a chemical pheromone that was able to control and manipulate splicer behaviors. On completion, Fontaine would eventually be able to control some of the splicers directly. It was becoming clear to Andrew Ryan that Fontaine was a predator who did not have Rapture's best interests at heart. He already held suspicions that Fontaine was behind the smuggling ring, and now with the possible pheromone production, he had become a bigger threat to Rapture than originally anticipated. It was only then did Andrew Ryan establish laws in Rapture and enacted policies on its citizens. Rogue splicers that caused significant danger to others and started fights were to be arrested. Vandalistic graffiti would not be tolerated, and vigilantism outside of Rapture's security forces would be outlawed. Frank Fontaine felt the increased security presence intrude into his smuggling ring and his plasmid business, which threatened his goals and his interests. Even with his profitable plasmid business and his criminal ring, he still could not beat Andrew Ryan and the citizens loyal to Rapture in a confrontation. He was also threatened by Sophia Lamb and her followers, as her faction would also be in the way if he was successful in overtaking Andrew Ryan and his city. Frank Fontaine noticed that Sophia Lamb was able to attract her followers by exploiting the vulnerabilities of the poor who had nowhere else to go. Lamb gave free counseling sessions and was able to win the loyalty of her patients through acts of charity. She got people on her side through her therapy sessions. She discovered what issues were troubling her patients and used those same issues as chains to enslave them. Fontaine also picked up Soviet literature during his smuggling operations, absorbing the Soviet narrative used by the Bolsheviks into a new character he was starting to develop, Atlas. He read from the works of John Reed, an American journalist who wrote about his first-hand experience of the Bolshevik Revolution in his book, 10 Days That Shook the World. John Reed was an enthusiastic supporter of the Socialist Revolution and held close ties with the inner circle of the socialist movement, meeting the leaders Leon Trotsky and Vladimir Lenin, who were later responsible for the purges that killed Andrew Ryan's friends and family, and what made Ayn Rand eventually flee Russia. Fontaine pored over the accounts of John Reed and the lives of Soviet idealists, changing paragraphs and terminologies of their narrative to suit Rapture's culture. He'd heavily rely on speeches delivered by Soviet leaders in order to appeal to the lower classes of Rapture. To gain moral support of the lower class, Fontaine used his profits from his plasmid business to set up charities around Rapture, including Fontaine's Home for the Poor and the Little Sisters Orphanage. Frank held no real compassion for his fellow man and was using these charities as fronts to fuel his own schemes. Fontaine got the money to build his charities by selling Adam, which was bought by people who were addicted to Adam. These addicts, who spent most of their savings on Fontaine's plasmids, were now relying on Fontaine's charities for assistance. The irony was not lost on Fontaine and many other citizens, that his system was specifically designed to exploit the very desperation that he created. Fontaine used these charity groups to gain support from the impoverished people of Rapture, offering them relief from the hardships of Andrew Ryan's prison city and help them through their Adam addiction. From this, he was able to turn citizens away from supporting Andrew Ryan into supporting himself. He also supplied these people with as many plasmids as they needed, which was all provided by his company. By splicing up his followers with plasmids, he transformed them into powerful weapons of war that were loyal to Fontaine. And once Dr. Sung Trong finished the chemical pheromone that could control splicers, he would be able to launch an armed assault directly against Andrew Ryan to overwhelm him and his followers. When Fontaine felt he was ready and had enough power on his side, he moved on to the next stage of his plans, enticing Andrew Ryan to a confrontation. He gave his mobsters the order to assassinate some of Andrew Ryan's men in order to anger him into action. 3 of Rapture's private security personnel were shot in the back in cold blood, and were laid out side by side for Andrew Ryan's inner circle to see. It didn't take long for Andrew Ryan to organize an armed assault against Fontaine in retaliation. In the bloody shootout that followed, it was believed that Fontaine was killed in action. Rapture's security forces had to retreat from the shootout, as Fontaine's splicers were winning the fight. But Fontaine was unharmed, and took this opportunity to change his identity again, secretly undergoing surgery with Dr. Steinman to change his physical appearance from Frank Fontaine into the new developed persona of Atlas. Although Andrew Ryan thought he was successful in killing Frank Fontaine, he wasn't successful in finishing his smuggling ring and the splicers that retreated from the shootout. These groups rallied under a new separate faction which would later be led by Atlas. It was here when Andrew Ryan abandoned his ideals of a non-interventionist Rapture and issued policies that resembled fascism to respond to these separatists. A curfew was implemented and enforced. Checkpoints were established that restricted citizens into authorized areas. Identification cards were needed to be carried by the people of Rapture. The presence of security turrets and security bots was increased, and capital punishment was placed on smugglers and rogue splicers that committed crimes. Andrew Ryan knew that he was following in the steps of totalitarian Soviet Russia. He justified that these actions were needed to get the situation stabilized. Rapture was losing its population in the crossfire, and it was difficult to recruit new people to refill those roles. The most controversial action that Andrew Ryan took was nationalizing Fontaine Futuristics after Frank Fontaine's assumed death. He expropriated his plasmids, his assets, and his money, taking over his business through force, which went against the Rapture ideals of respecting free trade and a free market. Most of his council advised against this, saying that it would be better if he offered Fontaine Futuristics to the new Atlas Group as a gesture of peace and goodwill. They argued that only some of those people worked for Fontaine, and most of his followers were just interested in his atom, missing the connection that Atlas and Fontaine was the same person. It would also demonstrate to the public that Rapture was not about to give up on its principles, and would continue to uphold the values of the city. But Andrew Ryan refused. He didn't trust Atlas or his group with Fontaine Futuristics, as Atlas adopted the same Soviet narrative used by the Bolsheviks to gain support. He also rejected the idea that he had nationalized the business, as Andrew Ryan built and owned most of Rapture anyway. He was not prepared to hand over the business and assets to the parasite Atlas, and instead promised that he'd break apart the company once the situation had improved. As Andrew Ryan adopted more authoritative policies that eroded the freedoms of Rapture, Atlas was able to use those policies against him to gather more support. The city's poor became the base of his new political movement, putting on theatrical performances as his new Atlas persona at Apollo Square. In his numerous public speeches, he said that the people had been lied to over and over again by Andrew Ryan, that he promised them a free market, but took over Fontaine Futuristics by force. Rapture was now a police state, with curfews and blockades implemented onto its own people. This was not utopia, it was a prison. Channeling John Reed's account of Bolshevism, he shouted that the wealth of Rapture belonged only to a greedy few, that the upper class accumulated 100 times what the working man earns, and that they got it because they were exploiting the working class. While the common man works, the rich sit in the penthouses drinking champagne and puffed on the imported cigars that workers were not allowed to have. Atlas also argued for wealth redistribution policies, advocating for a Share the Wealth program in Rapture. He would shout to his followers that wealth should not belong to a greedy few, but that it belonged to everyone, that every family should be given a basic allowance of 2,000 Rapture dollars to live on. This Share the Wealth narrative was inspired from American Democrat politician Huey Long, one of the first populist senators that argued for the radical redistribution of wealth. He advocated for labor reforms and redistributionist policies, arguing that high taxes should be placed against the wealthy elite. The revenue raised from these taxes would be used to fund public government programs, which he said would stop poverty and homelessness during the Great Depression.
That the 25 or more million American families shall have a homestead, a home, and the comforts of a home, including an automobile and a radio, the things it takes in that house to live on.
The wealth redistribution policies of Huey Long would inspire other politicians to use similar wealth redistribution narratives, which typically appeals to the mass voting base of the poor. To Andrew Ryan, the poor had every opportunity to earn a good living in Rapture. There was no regulations, no taxes, and no government control that impeded on the rights of the citizens. People were responsible for their own path, forged their own destiny, and were free to do whatever they wished in Rapture. If times got hard, they were expected to take on more jobs, cut rations, learn new skills, develop new networking contacts, do whatever it takes to make it work. There was no external forces that stopped them to achieve their best. Instead, these citizens squandered their Rapture dollars on Adam just so they can have a temporary drug-induced high, while sinking deeper into despair and addiction, just like the drunks and parasites on the surface. Those people never accepted personal responsibility for their own circumstances, and instead found comfort in blaming others for their own failures, even though Andrew Ryan had nothing to do with their depravity or the situation. And with political opportunists such as Atlas encouraging the victim mindset and scapegoating their problems on Andrew Ryan, it seemed there was no way out for him. The rising militancy of the political movement behind Atlas threatened Andrew Ryan, and a civil war was brewing. Factions and alliances were quickly forming in Rapture. It seemed there was no way out.
That's better. Atlas Ryan. Atlas Ryan. Da 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 da. Time was, you could get something decent on the radio. The artist has a duty to seduce the ear and delight the spirit. So say goodbye to those two blowhards, and hello to an evening with Sandra Cohen.
Sandra Cohen is an artist originating from New York who was invited to Rapture to become an important figure in Rapture's art community, eventually owning a nightclub and several galleries throughout the city. Being a close friend and ally to Andrew Ryan, Sandra Cohen's artistic and social abilities was used to promote the values of Rapture in his artworks as a form of propaganda. He was later asked to promote the interventionist policies of Andrew Ryan to raise public support for his actions. Artists, entertainers, and socialites are often used to promote or damage cultural narratives for public support, as the use of propaganda is an incredibly powerful tool for changing the hearts and minds of an audience. For Ayn Rand, it was art that inspired her to become the person she wanted to be. Ayn Rand was a teenager when foreign films were first allowed to be shown in Russian movie theaters. Her first precious glimpses of America came to her in cinema, where Rand was exposed to the shots of streets and the skyline of Manhattan. It resonated in her the vision of free men, which was full of glamour and romanticism.
And I remember there were some American movies where you could see New York, just shots. Usually long shots, and I would sit through 2 shows just to catch it because it would be very brief. They never had one that showed much, but you could get that glimpse once in a while. And I can't tell you how glamorous it was at that distance. And then I began to see movies every night practically. And that was the most wonderful period.
America, a land dedicated to protecting individual rights, stood in sharp contrast to the collectivism of communist Russia. Ayn Rand later described America as the greatest, the noblest, and, in its original founding principles, the only moral country in the history of the world.
Look, it's very hard to explain. It's almost impossible to convey to a free people what it's like to live in a totalitarian dictatorship. I can tell you a lot of details. I can never completely convince you because you are free. And it's in a way good that you can't even conceive of what it's like. Certainly they have friends and mother-in-laws. They try to live a human life, but you understand that it is totally inhuman. Now try to imagine what it's like if you are in constant terror from morning to night, and at night you're waiting for a doorbell to ring. If you are afraid of everything and everybody, if you live in a country where human life is nothing, less than nothing, and you know it, you don't know who, when is going to do what to you because he may have friends somewhere, where there is no law and no rights of any kind.
When Ayn Rand immigrated to America, her debut novel was We the Living, a story about life in post-revolutionary Russia. It was Rand's first statement against communism, and one of the first real-world depictions of what living in Soviet Russia was actually like. In the story, Rand exposed the ideals of collectivism through the lives of 3 young people, who were sacrificed to an all-powerful state. She continued to use her writing talents and screenwriting abilities to emotionally convey her ideas of individualism, heroism, and romanticism in her arts, which included books, movies, and plays. She had a significant influence on a variety of people, including writers, artists, and political figures such as Alan Greenspan, Penn Jillette, Ron Paul, Gene Roddenberry, and Donald Trump.
I mean, you can respect somebody that's beating the hell out of you, but they are beating the hell out of this country. Kuwait, they live like kings. The poorest person in Kuwait, they live like kings. And yet they're not paying. We make it possible for them to sell their oil. Why aren't they paying us 25% of what they're making? It's a joke.
They took our oil.
Well, what do you mean it's not our oil? It's not our, we don't own Saudi Arabia, they do.
We own by contract right the installations which we devised to begin with, and we help them to build. But they make a deal with us. They want to bring us in to develop their oil, and then they try to exploit and to literally murder us by means of that oil. That is unforgivable crime.
I mean, some in the Middle East would argue that it's, first of all, it's their oil.
No, it isn't. It was there for centuries, and they didn't know what to do with it. We don't export our technology. We export our minds and our knowledge, without which they couldn't exist, and they admit it. They nationalized oil in a lot of those countries, and then want the Americans or a few Europeans to come and help them run it. They can't even run the oil industry after they've copied everything from us. It can't be done.
What do you love?
Reason, heroism, the luminous potential of man.
Execrable claptrap.
I beg your pardon.
The reviews. Outpouring of hate, longer than life and twice as preposterous, crack-brained, they go on and on. Applauds the destruction of the weak to the advantage of the strong. Rand is arguing for a dictatorship.
You don't care if the poor starve.
Are you the head of a cult?
You're preaching selfishness. That's all it is.
This country took you in and gave you refuge. Don't you feel you owe it anything?
Yes, of course I do. And I have given it. I have given it everything I have. My work, my books, my life.
However, many American intellectuals and politicians were against the ideas of individualism and selfishness. They instead promoted the opposite values of collectivism and altruism in their countries, which is the same mysticism that was responsible for the spread of communism, socialism, and fascism throughout Europe. Those intellectuals were, and still are, fiercely against Ayn Rand and her works, purposely misrepresenting her philosophy, strawmanning her arguments, and trying to damage her reputation through character assassinations.
15 years ago, I was impressed with your books, and I sort of felt that your philosophy was proper. Today, however, I'm more educated, and I find that if a company...
This is what I don't answer.
Well, wait a minute, you haven't heard the question yet.
She's already estimated her position and my work, incidentally, displaying the quality of her brain. If she says today she is more educated, what does that mean?
Well, that means she now has a different view. There's nothing personal about that observation. Don't be so sensitive.
I am going to be. I intend to be.
Yes, Miss Rand, I was one of those people who belonged to your cult where we were devouring your books, and I just wanted to say that as I matured, I am glad that I was able to differentiate with your philosophies.
Did you see our show last year? You want to create an incident?
No.
Pass it up.
Oh, a good, vigorous exchange of views between two people who care and have differing positions is one of the most instructive things that can happen in a living room or on television.
I would love to see an honorable adversary, but I've stopped hoping for it.
But that's an arrogant position. What you're saying is all those who disagree with me are not honorable. That's what you're saying.
Not honorable in their ideas.
To the testament of Ayn Rand's legacy, these hit pieces still continue on today, which serves to damage the values of objectivism for the values of mysticism.
Kids like simplistic political philosophies. That appeals to them. And Ayn Rand also appeals to them. They read that when they're a little boy, almost always a boy, and it takes over their mind.
There are three things that scare me enough to make me flee as far away as I can get. Bad 80s music, someone trying to give me a bad haircut, and Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand, so far away. But if you go so far as to assert that something is the only rational choice, you should probably make an effort to support that prejudice with facts, and Rand unapologetically doesn't.
Now you're 24, and you're still reading Atlas Shrugged, and you're still saying, this makes sense. Odds are you're not nearly as thoughtful and intelligent and well-read as you think you are. And you're probably also an insufferable prick.
Today we are learning about an extremely famous person of inordinate philosophical influence, so allow me to summarize for you the work of Ayn Rand.
Look at this, man!
I mean, I'm an existentialist. I love philosophical novels, but the thing about hers, though, is that the philosophy is so childish and basic. You don't need these giant tomes to describe such a basic philosophy, like, you know.
Is that where we get Going Galt from as well? Or is that from Ayn Rand?
I haven't read either of the books in their entirety, but I read some of The Fountainhead, but that's all. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that. Anyway.
And look at how you have been attacked.
Oh, I know.
How you have been criticized. There
There
are many people in this country, forgive me, in this world who think you're daft.
They don't. They want you to sing that. Well, obviously.
I hear you. Yeah, okay.
It's coming together, yes. But there will always be doubters. You don't doubt me, do you?
I'm trying, Mr. Cohen, I'm trying. But no matter what I do, these parasites just won't listen.
Let them have their squabble. The artist, yes, the artist knows there is richer earth to till.
Okay, let's try something with a little more energy.
Kiss. Just kiss. 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 Just kiss. Kiss. Kissology.
Kiss. Kiss.
Please welcome the hottest band in the world, Kiss.
Here from Kiss is Gene Simmons.
Gene Simmons. He is the fire-breathing, blood-spitting monster of Kiss.
Actually, what I am is evil incarnate. And some of those cheeks and necks look really good.
The power of using art to subvert political narratives and cultures was especially relevant in the Cold War. Rock music played an important role in undermining the political agenda of the Soviet Union and its satellite states. Certain pop bands and rock music was banned under communism, as forbidden music was called fascistic anti-Soviet pollution by its authorities. Rock music was traded in the black market in the Eastern Bloc, where influential parents who traveled abroad brought back illegal music for their children at home. This music was then copied onto cassettes and sold to their fellow youths in the black market. These youths were attracted to Western music as it was unusual, sincere, and had high energy, creating an underground subculture movement within the Eastern Bloc.
I was made for loving you. You were made for loving me.
Through bands such as the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Kiss, a new counterculture of politically active rockers and hippies was born. These groups constantly undermined the Soviet authorities and its communist political system, as they traded Western music in the black market. The Berlin Wall, or the Anti-Fascistic Protection Wall, was the physical Iron Curtain that separated Western Europe and the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War. Western music artists, such as David Bowie, Bruce Springsteen, Michael Jackson, and David Hasselhoff would play in concerts in West Germany. During these concerts, they would point their speakers over the wall for their audience in East Germany. David Hasselhoff sang his #1 hit song, Looking for Freedom, on a platform at the end of a 20-meter steel crane. The crane swung above and over the wall adjacent to the Brandenburg Gate. When East German security forces tried to disband the crowd of fans that had gathered by the wall, the fans violently rioted in return, chanting "Tear down the wall" in response. When Springsteen played in West Germany, he told the crowd that he wasn't there to be for or against any government, but to play rock and roll in the hopes that one day all the barriers will be torn down. The crowd enthusiastically sung along to Born in the USA, while holding small hand-painted American flags. A few months after that concert, Erich Honecker, the leader of the German Democratic Republic of East Germany, resigned, and the Iron Curtain collapsed before the year had ended. It was these events that made rock music and art an important and underappreciated factor in the fall of communism. Andrew Ryan relied on Sander Cohen to help promote the interests of Rapture through his music. As Rapture's policies changed to become increasingly authoritative, Cohen was expected to continually support Andrew Ryan's narrative through his art, which he resented. His artistic rival, Anna Culpepper, denounced Cohen as Ryan's songbird, cleaning up after Andrew Ryan's mess with a song and a dance like a stable boy. Anna Culpepper eventually grew to support Atlas's political movement over Andrew Ryan's, and used her skills as an artist and performer to help promote Atlas's opposite narrative. This caused a great cultural and propaganda war within Rapture that coincides with the political one, which are typically echoed in societies just before periods of civil strife.
Never again I'll go sailing, no more sailing, so long.
Rapture's civil war officially started when a group of Atlas's men launched a surprise terror attack on Kashmir's restaurant during its New Year's Eve party. It was an opportunistic attack for Atlas's group, as most of the people at the party were unprepared and represented the upper class of Rapture. Andrew Ryan was expected to attend the New Year's Eve party as well, but he pulled out just before the terrorist attack. Rapture was split into 3 separate factions by the start of the Civil War. Sophia Lamb and her followers, who were cut from the city in a separate colony, Atlas and his revolutionaries, who aimed to take down Andrew Ryan and control the city themselves, and Andrew Ryan and the people still loyal to Rapture, who wanted to defend the city after many of their own were killed in the New Year's Eve attack. Andrew Ryan knew there could be no peace with Atlas after the terrorist attack, and so he was committed to winning the war through his superior might. Atlas had the upper hand in the Civil War due to his opening terrorist attack. His splicers had already controlled some of the city, but Andrew Ryan still had the Atom, the Plasmid Labs, and the loyalty of the citizens who believed in Rapture's future. Andrew Ryan's greatest assets was his intellect and will. He survived Soviet Russia to be one of the most richest and successful business tycoons in America. He built and created Rapture. He wasn't going to let the parasites tear down what he had created without a fight. The Civil War completely crippled Rapture's way of life. A bank run was made on the banks in the aftermath of the Kashmir attack, crippling the economy and banking services of Rapture. People stopped working and closed their stores in fear of terror attacks. Plasmid sales, Atom use, and weapon purchases increased dramatically as people prepared to defend themselves against the upcoming political strife. To Andrew Ryan, people had to choose a side. It was either defend Rapture or side with Atlas and his bandits. Be a hero or a criminal. There could be no in between. The psychological warfare and extreme stresses of Rapture's Civil War tested the resolve of all major characters in BioShock. Sandra Cohen's artistic work was no longer appreciated or sought by the people during the Civil War. He fell into deep depression and succumbed to excessive splicing to alleviate his pain, leading to permanent insanity from his Atom abuse. Both Sandra Cohen and Andrew Ryan hated the way Anna Culpepper was gathering support for Atlas and his revolutionary group. It was especially painful for Andrew Ryan as Culpepper was a prior member of Rapture's Central Council. He called her songs communist versifying and promised that the Little Red Bird would stop singing. Once the Civil War broke out, Ryan ordered Sullivan to kill Culpepper as a favor to Sandra Cohen and himself. Sullivan reluctantly complied, drowning Culpepper in her apartment as she took a bath. As he overpowered her and held her down underwater, her eyes never stopped staring at Sullivan. Disturbed with what he did, he took Culpepper's half-finished red and black knitted blanket from her apartment to remind himself of his actions.
It just didn't seem right to leave it lying there all by itself.
He couldn't live with the anguish and grief that he had caused to himself after her death. He left his last radio message to Andrew Ryan shortly after, expressing his love and respect for the great man in his final farewell. His body can be found in Neptune's Bounty. Bill McDonough, the head of maintenance, was also a member of Rapture's Central Council, but resigned once Andrew Ryan nationalized Fontaine Futuristics. They were close friends after Andrew Ryan found out that McDonough installed brass fixtures instead of tin in his private apartment. Andrew Ryan was impressed with Bill's work ethic and made him his general contractor. But once the Civil War started, Bill McDonough's wife, daughter, and city he had helped to build was placed in constant danger. He knew it would not end until Ryan or Atlas was dead. Because he had freedom of movement in Rapture, he was in the unique position of ending the Civil War by assassinating Andrew Ryan, his friend and employer.
I don't know if killing Mr. Ryan will stop the war, but I know it won't stop while that man breathes. I love Mr. Ryan, but I love Rapture. If I have to kill one to save the other, so be it.
Once Bill was alone with Andrew Ryan, he raised his pistol to shoot, but it trembled in his hand. Looking at the older man in his tailored three-piece grey suit and walking stick made his heart go out to him. Ryan had built this brave new world to match his dreams, but it fell apart to become his nightmare. He couldn't get himself to shoot the man who he trusted and loved, and so he fled the scene. He managed to send his wife and daughter out of Rapture in a bathysphere before Andrew Ryan's security forces arrested him. Bill's death was quick and painless. Neither Andrew Ryan nor his security force stood to watch him die, as Bill was considered a loyal friend to Rapture. His body was impaled on a pillar outside of Andrew Ryan's office as a warning to other traitors. In Sullivan's last radio message, he included a security recording of Jasmine Jolene. She was an exotic dancer at Fort Frolic and former mistress of Andrew Ryan. In the secret recording, Jasmine Jolene talked about being pregnant with Andrew Ryan's child. Andrew Ryan was unaware that Jasmine was carrying his child and got excited about leaving a legacy, but he soon became enraged after he discovered that Tenenbaum and Fontaine took her fetus after offering Jasmine a large amount of money.
I'm sorry, Mr. Ryan. I didn't know. I didn't know Fontaine had something to do with it. What are you doing? No, don't, please. I loved you. Don't, please, no.
Andrew Ryan had killed the mother of his child. Sandra Cohen was lost in insanity. Ex-council member Anna Culpepper was murdered in a bathtub. Sullivan had killed himself in grief. Bill McDonough's body was crucified after his failed assassination. Most of Andrew Ryan's inner circle was dead or gone. And now, Andrew Ryan had learned that Jasmine Jolene had sold his only child to his enemy. There was not many people he could trust in his city, and Andrew Ryan fell into deep depression. He began to drink gin martinis heavily, using alcohol as his crutch.
Could I have made mistakes? One does not build cities if one is guided by doubt. But can one govern in absolute certainty? I know that my beliefs have elevated me just as I know that the things I have rejected would have destroyed me. But the city, it's collapsing before my eyes. Have I become so convinced by my own beliefs that I have stopped seeing the truth? Perhaps. But Atlas is out there, and he aims to destroy me and to destroy my city. To question is to surrender. I will not question.
The only character in BioShock who was not negatively affected by the Civil War was Atlas, the man who had no values and no ideals, a man who was nothing but his lies, and the man who murdered Diane McClintock once she discovered who Atlas really was. Despite the many setbacks and distresses suffered by Andrew Ryan was still the strong individualist he always was. A Russian Jew who escaped Soviet Russia to become one of the most successful and richest business tycoons in America. He created Rapture. He built Rapture. His strength wasn't in steel or fire, but in intellect and will. In response to the Civil War, Ryan Industries engineered new turret defenses, security bots, genetic keys, and maintained stronger control over his city. The new Vita chamber devices could raise his men back from the dead. And Dr. Sun Trong's pheromone conditioning research was complete, which means he could now turn Atlas's own splices against him. The population of Rapture had suffered immensely, and many had died to defend the city. But once Andrew Ryan was able to control the splices and use them to rid the city of the rebels, he would then be able to restore Rapture to how it was.
Rapture is coming back to life. Even now, can't you hear the breath returning to her lungs? The shops reopening, the schools humming with the thoughts of young minds. My city will live. My city will thrive.
Atlas was on the run. His civil war had failed. It was only a matter of time before he was captured and executed by Andrew Ryan's men. but Atlas had an ace in the hole. It was here that the players of BioShock stepped into the story.
I don't know how you survived that plane crash, but I've never been one to question Providence. I'm Atlas, and I aim to keep you alive.
The player is the illegitimate love child of Jasmine Jolene and Andrew Ryan, bought as an embryo by Fontaine, and genetically enhanced with plasmids by Dr. Tenenbaum to reach adulthood in 4 years. Being Andrew Ryan's son, you share his genetic code, which means you could access areas that needed his genetic key, travel in bathyspheres that were available only to him, could use his Vita chambers that were not genetically calibrated to anyone else, and his security boss and turrets had difficulties targeting you. Loaded with weapons, plasmids, and sharing Andrew Ryan's genetic code made you a powerful force within Rapture, giving you the clear upper hand in the Civil War. Typical of Frank Fontaine, the Atlas persona fed you misinformation and lies in your playthrough of BioShock, manipulating you to achieve Atlas's own goals at the expense of your own. He appealed to your empathy by staging a fake death of his non-existent family. He encouraged you to kill the Little Sisters for their Adam, dehumanizing them as little Frankensteins, even though it was him that mass-produced unstable plasmids for the Little Sisters and his Civil War. And once you were not useful to him anymore, you were expected to get stepped on by a Big Daddy, even though he thought of you as family. His Atlas persona fooled most citizens of Rapture, including Andrew Ryan. But unlike the other characters of BioShock, you didn't have any choice to resist his commands. You were genetically conditioned to respond to certain phrases and the demands of others, robbing you of your free will and your capacity to choose, which means most of the player's actions is to be blamed on Frank Fontaine, not the player himself. Through your biological conditioning, Atlas forced you to kill most of Rapture's splices that were under the control of Andrew Ryan, break through Rapture's defenses, and save or kill the Little Sisters who were responsible for Adam production. You were the ace in the hole that turned the tide of the Civil War to Atlas's favor. By the time you were at Andrew Ryan's doorstep, he and his city was defeated by your hand.
On the surface, I once bought a forest. The parasites claimed that the land belonged to God and demanded that I establish a public park there. Why? So the rebel could stand slack-jawed under the canopy and pretend that it was paradise earned. When Congress moved to nationalize my forest, I burnt it to the ground. God did not plant the seeds of this Arcadia. I did.
To Andrew Ryan, the parasites had followed him into his city and were successful in taking Rapture away from him. But just like the forest he had bought on the surface, he would rather see it destroyed than have it fall into the hands of the unearned.
Even in the Book of Lies, sometimes you find truth. There is indeed a season for all things. And now that I see you flesh to flesh and blood to blood, I know I cannot raise my hand against you. But know this, you are my greatest disappointment. Does your master hear me? Atlas, you can kill me, but you will never have my city. My strength is not in steel and fire. That is what the parasites will never understand. A season for all things. A time to live and a time to die. A time to build and a time to destroy!
He intended to destroy it, with him and everyone in the city buried with it, but not before one last conversation with what he would call his greatest disappointment, his son.
The assassin has overcome my final defense, and now he's come to murder me. In the end, what separates a man from a slave? Money? Power? No. A man chooses. A slave obeys.
In your playthrough, you were led to believe that Andrew Ryan, the man who had been mocking, tormenting, and attacking you, was the villain of Rapture, and that Atlas was your only true friend that you could rely on. It's only in the end do you learn that Andrew Ryan was not the villain of Rapture, but was actually one of the most honest, rational, and virtuous men still left in the city. Under different circumstances, he would have cared for you and loved you as his son. But because you were a slave to Atlas, you were his greatest disappointment. Andrew Ryan chose not to fight with you. Instead, Andrew Ryan chose to make you murder him, using the same social conditioning that Atlas instilled in you. He demonstrated that you were nothing but a slave, a pawn for Atlas that had been bred and conditioned to serve him. Andrew Ryan was prepared to die for his integrity and his own ideology, to show you that he was the master of his life and his own fate, not you or Atlas. He chose to die, whereas you can't choose to do anything. You were nothing. You had no family, no friends, no self-interest, and no free will. The player was a sacrificial animal that didn't exist for his own sake, but existed only to serve others, as he had no will of his own. Andrew Ryan chose to die as a free man, while his son would die as a slave. Andrew Ryan never made the connection that Atlas and Frank Fontaine was the same person. He assumed that Atlas didn't know how to reverse Rapture's self-destruction mechanism within minutes after his death, but Frank Fontaine knew.
Hurry now! Grab Ryan's genetic key! Now would you kindly put it in that goddamn machine?
After Andrew Ryan's death, the rest of the game was about establishing your own will in the world, reflecting the Ayn Rand objectivist ethos that people ought to live for their own sake and their own mind, something that was conditioned out of the player at birth, and something that was only made clear once your father, the only person who was honest with you, forced you to kill him. After the player breaks his control from Atlas and retains his free will, he moves on to help Tenenbaum, saving the most vulnerable and innocent people in Rapture, the children. Many of them grow up to have normal lives and relationships on the surface. The current fate of Rapture is unknown. The fictional city of Rapture did fall from grace into a dystopian nightmare, but the reasons for such cannot be blamed on objectivism, capitalism, or individualism. The fall of Rapture was due to the abandonment of those principles. Andrew Ryan allowed his small government to overstep their bounds. They regulated trade, seized assets, and killed people who disagreed with their policies, which are the very real dangers of government, and is what the life of Ayn Rand reflected on. Frank Fontaine manipulated the poor through brutality, lies, altruism, and plasmids to start a war with Andrew Ryan and the upper class. The splices of Rapture could not be reasoned with, and were guided by their own violent impulses of pheromones in the air. They had lost their free will. There is no society that can prevent its own collapse once rational people lose their minds the way the splices did. Ultimately, the fall of Rapture can't be faulted on Andrew Ryan or Frank Fontaine. Fontaine. It wasn't the splices, or the plasmids, or the big daddies, or being under the ocean. At the end, what destroyed Rapture is the very real thing that threatens to destroy our world. It's what every rational philosopher informs us about. It was what Ayn Rand dedicated her life to warn us about, and it's what the characters of BioShock urged us about. At the end, the only thing that can end our world is the end of reason.
Love is a command to rise to one's highest potential, the best and noblest vision of ourselves. Love is a reward, the greatest we can earn, granted to us for the moral qualities we have achieved in our lives.
The philosophical lessons of BioShock is not just limited to Rapture, but refers to bigger themes relating to our world, which includes politics, economics, and culture. Ancient Greek philosopher Socrates, named the father of Western philosophy, was tried and sentenced to death for corrupting the youth through his reasoning. Aristotle, the only philosopher that inspired Ayn Rand, had to flee his home after the priests denounced him for impiety, stating that he would not allow the Athenians to sin against philosophy twice. Ayn Rand fled Soviet Russia in total disgust with its mysticism, dedicating her life to promoting the values of virtue and reason in the West, which attracted many attacks on her character to this day. And as the world further slides into the madness caused by collectivism, altruism, and irrationality, the need for heroes that are guided by virtue and reason has never been stronger. And now, it's only at the very end do you understand that this presentation was not made for you, it was made for me. That it was this game that first introduced me to the philosophy of reason, virtue, and selfishness many years ago. That it was through this philosophy that I have found true meaning and happiness in my own life. Because I'm a man who chooses to live, chooses to think, and chooses to act in my own rational self-interest. I have sworn that I will never live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for mine. What about you? Are you a man or a slave? Will you sleepwalk through life being manipulated by worthless collectivist parasites who are only interested in using you for their own sacrificial purposes? Or will you wake up to choose your own destiny? A destiny that is based on reason, that's based on virtue, and based on your own rational self-interest. I have achieved true happiness and love for my life because I have worked to earn it. I have worked to achieve it, and now I am entitled to have it. Because a man chooses his own destiny, a slave can only obey. Don't obey. Choose. Choose. Choose!
Andrew Ryan reminds us we all make choices, but in the end, our choices make us.
I dreamed of a computer that could think for itself.
You travel within the glory of my memories. Insect. I can feel your fear as you tread the endless expanse of my mind.
Make yourself comfortable. Before long, I will decorate my home
with your carcass. Where are you, insect? shaped these humans into virulent sculptures.
I will find you.
My eyes are everywhere.